How's it going, everyone? It's ZLR, and today I am doing my Week 17 recap video. Actually, most of this recap video is being recorded on a Monday instead of Tuesday whenever I actually do it. Um, the last game I'll probably do either tonight or tomorrow, and then I'll post it. Um, but anyway, let's just get right into this. We have the Chiefs and the Steelers first on Christmas, with the Chiefs win at 29 to 10. We had Patrick Mahomes complete 29 passes out of 38 attempts, 320 yards and 3 touchdowns. Kareem Hunt had 9 carries for 20 yards and a touchdown. Isaiah Pacheco had 6 carries for 18 yards. Patrick Mahomes had 1 carry for 12 yards. Xavier Worthy had 2 carries for 10 yards. And Sam J. Perine had 2 carries for 9 yards. Travis Kelce had 8 receptions for 84 yards and a touchdown. Xavier Worthy had 8 receptions for 79 yards and a touchdown. We had Justin Watson with 2 receptions, 60 yards and a touchdown. We had Hollywood Brown with 4 receptions for 46 yards. Sam J. Perine with 2 receptions for 20 yards. Juju Smith with 2 receptions for 18 yards. DeAndre Hopkins with 2 receptions for 7 yards, and Noah Gray with 1 reception for 6 yards. For the Steelers side of things, we have Russell Wilson complete 23 passes out of 37 attempts, 205 yards, and a interception. Najee Harris had 13 carries for 74 yards. We had Jaylen Warren with 11 carries for 71 yards. Russell Wilson had 6 carries for 55 yards and a touchdown, and Cordero Patterson had 1 carry for 2 yards. Pat Freiermuth had 7 receptions for 60 yards. George Pickens had 3 receptions for 50 yards. Jaylen Warren had 5 receptions for 41 yards. We had Calvin Austin with 4 receptions for 31 yards. We had Connor Hayward with 1 reception for 8 yards, as well as Darnell Washington. And we had Najee Harris with 2 receptions for 7 yards. Then we had a absolute beating in the next game on Christmas, as we had the Ravens and the Texans, with the Ravens winning at 31 to 2. I don't think I've ever seen a team lose with just the safety as their only points. But at least in my lifetime. But anyway, we had Lamar Jackson complete 10 passes out of 15 attempts, 168 yards and 2 touchdowns. We also had Josh Johnson with 1 completion out of 2 attempts for 16 yards. Derrick Henry had 27 carries, 147 yards and a touchdown. Lamar Jackson had 4 carries, 87 yards and a touchdown. We had Keaton Mitchell with 11 carries for 20 yards, and Rasheen Ali, actually. I thought there was an M there, not an N. 1 carry for a negative 3 yards. Mark Andrews had 2 receptions, 68 yards, and a touchdown. Zay Flowers had 2 receptions for 31 yards. Keaton Mitchell had 1 reception for 28 yards. Derrick Henry had 2 receptions for 18 yards. We had Anthony Miller with 1 reception for 16 yards. Rashad Bateman with 1 reception for 12 yards. Isaiah Likely with 1 reception, 9 yards, and a touchdown. And Tylan Wallace with 1 reception for 2 yards. For the Texans side of things, we had CJ Stroud complete 17 passes out of 31 attempts, 185 yards, and a interception. We also had Davis Mills complete a pass out of his 1 attempt for 5 yards. Joe Mixon had 9 carries for 26 yards. Damian Pierce had 5 carries for 13 yards. Dare Ungambale had 2 carries for 12 yards, and CJ Stroud had 1 carry for 7 yards. Nico Collins had 3 receptions for 59 yards. John Mechie had 5 receptions for 48 yards. Xavier Hutchinson had 2 receptions for 21 yards. We had Robert Woods with 2 receptions, 21 yards, as well as Dalton Schultz. We also had Joe Mixon with 2 receptions for 13 yards. Dare Ungumbale with 1 reception for 6 yards, and Cade Stover with 1 reception for 1 yard. Then we go on to the day after Christmas with the Seahawks having a very weird game against the Bears, winning that one 6-3. Probably one of the worst Thursday night football games I've seen in a while. Geno Smith completed 17 passes out of 23 attempts for 160 yards. Zach Charbonnet had 15 carries for 57 yards. We had Kenny McIntosh with 7 carries for 46 yards, and Geno Smith with 3 carries for 19 yards. Noah Fant had 4 receptions for 43 yards. DK Metcalf had 3 receptions for 42 yards. Jackson Smith had 3 receptions for 32 yards. Tyler Lockett had 3 receptions for 20 yards. Zach Charbonnet had 3 receptions for 19 yards. And Pharaoh Brown had 1 reception for 4 yards. For the Bears side of things, we had Caleb Williams with 16 completions out of 28 attempts, 122 yards, and 8 interception. DeAndre Swift had 12 carries for 53 yards. Caleb Williams had 5 carries for 37 yards. DJ Moore had 2 carries for 8 yards. And Roschon Johnson had 4 carries for 5 yards. DJ Moore had 6 receptions for 54 yards. DeAndre Swift had 4 receptions for 28 yards. Keenan Allen had 5 receptions for 25 yards. And Rome Odunze had 1 reception for 15 yards. Then we go on to Saturday's games, with the first one being the Chargers and the Patriots. Yeah, that game was just not great. Honestly, I kind of wish that it didn't go that way, but I mean, it was gonna have to anyway. But we had Justin Herbert complete 26 passes out of 38 attempts, 281 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Taylor Heineke had 2 attempts at passing. Oh yeah, by the way, the Chargers won 40-7. J.K. Dobbins had 19 carries for 76 yards and a touchdown. Hassan Haskins had 8 carries for 30 yards. Kamani Vidal had 5 carries for 24 yards. Justin Herbert had 3 carries for 12 yards. Taylor Heineke had 1 carry for 8 yards. And Darius Davis had 1 carry for -3 yards. Then we had Lab McConkey with 8 receptions for 94 yards and 2 touchdowns. Quentin Johnston with 5 receptions for 48 yards. We had Joshua Palmer with 4 receptions for 41 yards. We had Darius Davis with 2 receptions for 29 yards and a touchdown. Stone Smart with 2 receptions for 23 yards. Will Dissly with 2 receptions for 21 yards. Hassan Haskins with 1 reception for 10 yards. We had Tucker Fisk with 1 reception for 8 yards. And J.K. Dobbins with 1 reception for 7 yards. For the Patriots side of things, we had Drake May complete 12 passes out of 22 attempts, 117 yards, and a touchdown. And Jacoby Brissett had 1 completion out of 2 attempts for -2 yards. There was a scary scene when Drake May possibly had a head injury, but he did come back out into the game. So we're just going to have to see what happens, like what they really say. Antonio Gibson had 12 carries for 63 yards. Drake May had 6 carries for 32 yards. And Ramondre Stevenson had 2 carries for 1 yard. That really pissed me off. Demario Douglas had 4 receptions, 46 yards, and a touchdown, which was a beautiful one. Kayshon Boutte had 4 receptions for 28 yards. Kendrick Bourne had 2 receptions for 22 yards. And Austin Hooper had 3 receptions for 19 yards. Not a lot of receivers in our game. Then we had the first out of two overtime games that happened this week with the Bengals and the Broncos. With the Bengals win at 30-24. And that's practically the same score that happened for the Commanders and Falcons, which is actually going to be the last one I talk about until I make the other video tonight about the game that happens. But we had Bo Nix complete 24 passes out of 31 attempts, 219 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a interception. Jaleel McLaughlin had 10 carries for 69 yards. Nice. Bo Nix had 7 carries for 31 yards. Audric Estime had 9 carries for 24 yards. And Marvin Mims had 1 carry for a -1 yard. He also had 8 receptions for 103 yards and 2 touchdowns. Cortland Sutton had 5 receptions, 55 yards, and a touchdown. Devon Vele had 2 receptions, 27 yards. Audric Estime had 1 reception for 13 yards. Jaleel McLaughlin had 2 receptions for 7 yards. Nate Adkins had 1 reception for 7 yards. We had Adam Trotman with 1 reception for 5 yards. Lucas Kroll with 1 reception for 3 yards. We had Javonte Williams catch 2 balls but didn't get anything out of it. And Troy Franklin had 1 catch but got -1 yard from that. Joe Burrow completed 39 passes out of 49 attempts, 412 yards, and 3 touchdowns. We had Chase Brown with 20 carries for 67 yards. Joe Burrow had 4 carries, 25 yards, and a touchdown. And Khalil Herbert had 4 carries for 23 yards. T. Higgins had 11 receptions, 131 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Jamar Chase had 9 receptions, 102 yards. Mike Gesicki had 10 receptions for 86 yards. Andre Losevis had 3 receptions for 59 yards. Chase Brown had 4 receptions for 24 yards. We had Cam Grandy with 1 reception for 7 yards, and Drew Sample with 1 reception for 3 yards. Then we had the Rams and the Cardinals, with the Rams win at 13-9. Kyler Murray had 33 completions out of 48 attempts, 321 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. We had Michael Carter with 13 carries for 70 yards, Kyler Murray with 4 carries for 32 yards. We had Michael Wilson with 1 carry for 7 yards, and James Conner with 4 carries for 4 yards. Trey McBride had 12 receptions, 123 yards, and a touchdown. He finally got his first touchdown of the season. Marvin Harrison Jr. had 6 receptions for 96 yards. Elijah Higgins had 2 receptions for 23 yards. Michael Wilson had 4 receptions for 22 yards. Zay Jones had 1 reception for 19 yards. Greg Dortch had 3 receptions for 18 yards. Michael Carter had 2 receptions for 11 yards. We had DJ Dallas with 1 reception for 5 yards, and James Conner with 2 receptions for 4 yards. We also had on the Rams side Matthew Stafford completing 17 passes out of 32 attempts for 189 yards. Kyren Williams had 13 carries, 56 yards, and a touchdown. Matthew Stafford had 6 carries for 16 yards. And Blake Corum had 3 carries but got -4 yards. And for the receiving side of things, we had Puka Nacua with 10 receptions, 129 yards. Cooper Kupp with 1 reception for 29 yards. Kyren Williams with 3 receptions for 16 yards. Tyler Higbee with 2 receptions for 9 yards. And Jordan Whittington with 1 reception for 6 yards. Then we had the Cowboys taking on the Eagles, with the Eagles win at 41-7. We had Cooper Rush complete 15 passes out of 28 attempts, 147 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Rico Dowdle had 23 carries for 104 yards. Devontae Turpin had 2 carries for 18 yards. Ezekiel Elliott had 3 carries for 2 yards, and Cooper Rush had 1 carry for 2 yards. We had Brandon Brooks with 4 receptions for 52 yards, Jalen Tolbert with 3 receptions, 30 yards, and a touchdown, Jake Ferguson with 3 receptions, 18 yards, Cavante Turpin had 1 reception for 16 yards, Jonathan Mingo and Jalen Brooks with 1 reception for 12 yards. For some reason, I was thinking about another Brooks. Rico Dowdle with 1 reception for 4 yards. Ryan Flournoy with 1 reception for 3 yards. And Hunter Lupke with 1 reception for 1 yard. For the Eagles side of things, we had Kenny Pickett with 10 completions out of 15 attempts, 143 yards, and a touchdown. And Tanner McKee had 3 completions out of 4 attempts, 54 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Saquon Barkley, 31 carries, 167 yards, and officially over the 2,000 rushing yards mark. He could beat Eric Dickerson's record next week. Then we have Tyron Davis Price with 3 carries for 7 yards. Kenneth Gainwell with 3 carries for 4 yards. Kenny Pickett with 3 carries, 3 yards, and a touchdown. And Tanner McKee had 2 carries, but got negative 2 yards from that. Devonta Smith had 6 receptions, 120 yards, and 2 touchdowns. A.J. Brown had 3 receptions, 36 yards, and a touchdown. We had Grant Calcaterra with 1 reception for 34 yards. Kenneth Gainwell with 1 reception for 5 yards. And Saquon Barkley with 2 receptions for 2 yards. Then we had the Panthers and the Buccaneers, with the Buccaneers smoking them 48-14. We had Bryce Young, 15 completions out of 28 attempts, 203 yards, and 2 touchdowns. We had Raheem Blackshear with 8 carries for 20 yards. We have Mike Boone with 2 carries for 11 yards. Bryce Young with 2 carries for 8 yards. And Velus Jones Jr. had 1 carry but didn't get anything out of it. Adam Thielen with 5 receptions, 110 yards, and 2 touchdowns. We have Jalen Coker with 2 receptions for 35 yards. Xavier Leggett with 5 receptions for 28 yards. We had David Moore with 1 reception for 17 yards. Dan Chisna with 1 reception for 8 yards. And Jatavion Sanders with 1 reception for 5 yards. For the Buccaneers side of things, we have Baker Mayfield complete 27 passes out of 32 attempts, 359 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Bucky Irving had 20 carries, 113 yards. We had Sean Tucker with 8 carries for 39 yards. Rachaad White with 6 carries for 30 yards. We had Cameron Johnson with 1 carry for 11 yards. We had Jalen McMillan with 1 carry for 9 yards. Baker Mayfield with 1 carry for 2 yards. And Kyle Trask had 3 carries but got negative 2 yards from that. Mike Evans had 8 receptions, 97 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Bucky Irving had 4 receptions for 77 yards. We had Devin Culp with 3 receptions for 52 yards. We had Jalen McMillan with 5 receptions, 51 yards, and 2 touchdowns. We had Payne Durham with 2 receptions, 36 yards, and a touchdown. We also have Ryan Miller with 2 receptions for 26 yards. Raheem Jarrett with 1 reception for 11 yards. Sean Tucker with 1 reception for 5 yards. And Rachaad White with 1 reception for 4 yards. Then we had the Bills and the Jets, with the Bills win at 40-14. Aaron Rodgers had 12 completions at 18 attempts, 112 yards, and 2 interceptions, while Tyrod Taylor had 11 completions out of 14 attempts for 83 yards and 2 touchdowns. We had Breece Hall with 10 carries, 45 yards, Isaiah Davis with 3 carries for 35 yards. Braylon Allen with 6 carries for 26 yards. And Tyrod Taylor with 2 carries for 6 yards. We had Garrett Wilson with 7 receptions, 66 yards, and a touchdown. Tyler Conklin with 8 receptions, 57 yards, and a touchdown. Devontae Adams with 5 receptions for 47 yards. Allen Lazard with 1 reception for 9 yards. Isaiah Davis and Breece Hall both had 1 reception for 8 yards. And for the Bills side of things, we had Josh Allen complete 16 passes out of 27 attempts, 182 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Then we also had Mitchell Trubisky with 1 completion out of 1 attempt for 69 yards and a touchdown. Nice. James Cook had 15 carries, 53 yards, and a touchdown. Josh Allen had 5 carries, 17 yards, and a touchdown. We had Ty Johnson with 4 carries for 16 yards. Ray Davis with 6 carries for 9 yards. Reggie Gilliam with 2 carries for 3 yards. And Mitchell Trubisky with 2 carries for -1 yard. We had Tyrell Shavers with 1 reception, 69 yards, and a touchdown, which is probably that touchdown that Mitchell Trubisky threw. And I'm also going to say it again. Nice. We had Amari Cooper with 3 receptions, 56 yards, and a touchdown. Mac Hollins with 2 receptions for 33 yards. Keon Coleman with 3 receptions, 27 yards, and a touchdown. Khalil Shakir with 3 receptions for 25 yards. Dalton Kincaid with 2 receptions for 24 yards. Ty Johnson with 1 reception for 9 yards. And both Ray Davis and Dawson Knox had 1 reception for 4 yards. Then we had the Indianapolis Colts and the New York Giants, with the Giants win at 45-33. And with that win, the New England Patriots have the first overall pick in the draft. And now I really hope we lose to the Bills this week because I want to keep that. We have Joe Flacco with 26 completions out of 38 attempts, 330 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Jonathan Taylor had 32 carries, 125 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Joe Flacco had 1 carry for 1 yard. We had Alec Pierce with 6 receptions for 122 yards and a touchdown. Michael Pittman Jr. had 9 receptions, 109 yards, and a touchdown. We had Kylan Granson with 3 receptions for 34 yards. Josh Downs with 3 receptions for 22 yards. Donnie Mitchell with 2 receptions for 22 yards. Jonathan Taylor with 2 receptions for 11 yards. And Trey Sermon with 1 reception for 10 yards. For the Giants side of things, we had Drew Lock, 17 completions out of 23 attempts, 309 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Tyrone Tracy Jr. had 20 carries for 59 yards. Devin Singletary had 5 carries for 21 yards. And Drew Lock had 5 carries, has 0 yards, but has a touchdown. That just looks like a weird stat line there, but he probably got a yard and then lost it. Malik Neighbors had 7 receptions, 171 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Wan'Dale Robinson had 5 receptions, 71 yards, and a touchdown. Darius Slayton had 1 reception, 32 yards, and a touchdown. We had Tyrone Tracy Jr. have 2 receptions for 14 yards. Chris Manhertz had 1 reception for 12 yards, and Devin Singletary had 1 reception for 9 yards. Then we had the Raiders and the Saints, with the Raiders win at 25-10. Aiden O'Connell had 20 completions out of 35 attempts, 242 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Amir Abdullah had 20 carries for 115 yards. Alexander Madison had 10 carries for 32 yards. We had Chris Collier with 3 carries for 6 yards. We had Trey Tucker with 1 carry for 5 yards. Aiden O'Connell had 3 carries but got -1 yard. And Brock Bowers had 1 carry but got -1 yard. Brock Bowers had 7 receptions for 77 yards, which broke Mike Ditka's record for most receiving yards by a rookie tight end of all time, with Brock Bowers going over 1,100 in this game. He also broke the rookie record for just Raiders in general for receiving yards as well. He beat I think it was Amari Cooper. There was also and then he also broke the rookie reception record as well. Like, dude's crazy. Uh Jacoby Myers had 5 receptions, 61 yards, and a touchdown. Amir Abdullah had 3 receptions, 32 yards. We had Terrace Marshall Jr. with 1 reception for 28 yards. Trey Tucker had 2 receptions, 24 yards, and a touchdown. Michael Mayer had 1 reception for 14 yards. And Alexander Madison had 1 reception for 6 yards. For the Saints side of things, we had Spencer Rattler with 20 completions out of 36 attempts, 218 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. We had Spencer Rattler also carry the ball 3 times for 46 yards. We had Clyde Edwards-Helaire with 5 carries for 20 yards. We had Jamal Williams with 2 carries for 12 yards. And Kendre Miller with 3 carries for 3 yards. We had Jawan Johnson with 6 receptions for 66 yards, the 666. Frank Moranu, no, Foster Moranu, wrong guy. 3 receptions, 47 yards, and a touchdown. We had Dante Pettis with 3 receptions for 27 yards. We have Kevin Austin with 1 reception for 23 yards. We had Cedric Wilson Jr. with 3 receptions, 17 yards. Kendre Miller with 1 reception for 16 yards. Jamal Williams with 1 reception for 12 yards. And Clyde Edwards-Helaire with 2 receptions for 10 yards. By the way, when I mentioned the Amari Cooper record thing being broken, I meant the rookie receiving record for the Raiders. I think he had 1,054 from what I believe, and Brock Bowers definitely broke that with the 1,100 plus that he got as of right now, and just wanted to clear that one up for you guys. Never mind, it was 1,070 yards for Amari Cooper. And then we had the Jaguars and the Titans, with the Jaguars win at 20-13. We had Mason Rudolph complete 19 passes out of 31 attempts, 193 yards, a touchdown, and a interception. Tajay Spears had 20 carries for 95 yards. Mason Rudolph had 5 carries for 23 yards. Julius Chestnut had 3 carries for 17 yards. Chig Okonkwo had 1 carry for 17 yards. Calvin Ridley had 1 carry for 7 yards. Caught myself when I was saying receptions. Calvin Ridley had 5 receptions for 84 yards. We had Chig Okonkwo with 5 receptions for 42 yards. Nick Westbrook had 3 receptions for 37 yards. Tyler Boyd had 2 receptions for 14 yards. Tajay Spears had 3 receptions for 8 yards. And Nick Vannett had 1 reception, 8 yards, and a touchdown. For the Jaguars side of things, we had old Mac Jones with 15 completions out of 22 attempts, 174 yards, 2 touchdowns. pretty good game from Mac Jones. We had Travis Etienne with 15 carries for 49 yards, Tank Bigsby with 11 carries for 33 yards, Mac Jones with 6 carries for 22 yards, and Brian Thomas Jr. with 1 carry for 18 yards. He also had 7 receptions for 91 yards and a touchdown. We had Parker Washington with 3 receptions, 31 yards, and a touchdown. Travis Etienne Jr. with 1 reception for 26 yards. We had D'Ernest Johnson with 2 receptions for 11 yards. We had Tim Jones with 1 reception for 11 yards. Devin Duvernay with 1 reception for 4 yards. Then we had the Dolphins and the Browns, with the Dolphins win at 20-3. We had Tyler Huntley with 22 completions out of 26 attempts, 225 yards and a touchdown. He also had 7 carries for 52 yards and a touchdown. Devon Achane had 10 carries for 25 yards. We had Jeff Wilson with 3 carries for 5 yards. Raheem Mostert with 6 carries for 3 yards. And Malik Washington had 1 carry but got negative 11 yards from it. Tyreek Hill had 9 receptions for 105 yards. Malik Washington had 4 receptions for 41 yards. We had Jonnu Smith with 3 receptions, 26 yards, and a touchdown. Raheem Mostert had 2 receptions for 16 yards. We had River Carcraft with 1 reception for 16 yards. Devon Achane with 2 receptions for 13 yards. And Dwayne Eskridge with 1 reception for 8 yards. For the Browns side of things, we had Dorian Thompson-Robinson completing 24 passes out of 47 attempts, 170 yards, and an interception. We had Donta Foreman with 13 carries, 49 yards. Pierre Strong Jr. with 5 carries for 33 yards. Jerome Ford with 6 carries for 22 yards. Dorian Thompson-Robinson with 4 carries for 10 yards. Jerry Jeudy had 12 receptions, 94 yards. Jordan Atkins had 6 receptions for 49 yards. Pierre Strong Jr. had 3 receptions for 15 yards. We have Blake Whiteheart with 1 reception for 8 yards. Michael Woods with 1 reception for 3 yards. And Elijah Moore with 1 reception for 1 yard. Then we had the Packers and the Vikings, with the Vikings win at 27-25. We had Jordan Love complete 19 passes out of 30 attempts, 185 yards and a touchdown. Josh Jacobs had 17 carries for 69 yards, nice, and a touchdown. Emmanuel Wilson had 6 carries for 29 yards and a touchdown. And Jordan Love had one carry for 6 yards. I also said reception. Romeo Doubs had 7 receptions, 58 yards. We had Tucker Kraft with 2 receptions for 53 yards. Dontavian Wicks with 4 receptions for 43 yards. Bo Melton with 3 receptions, 18 yards. Jaden Reed with 1 reception for 6 yards. Luke Musgrave with 1 reception for 4 yards. And Malik Heath with 1 reception, 3 yards, and a touchdown. Did I say Luke Musgrave? I hope I did. But also, I think for I think for someone I said the wrong yards for, but I'll watch it back and make sure I did or didn't. Sam Darnold completed 33 passes out of 43 attempts, 377 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 8 interception. Aaron Jones had 12 carries for 47 yards. Cam Akers had 6 carries for 18 yards. Ty Chandler had 5 carries for 7 yards. And Sam Darnold had 3 carries but got negative 3 yards from that. Justin Jefferson had 8 receptions, 92 yards. Sorry about the cut there. I got a call from my insurance company about my truck. But we also had Jalen Naylor, 5 receptions, 81 yards, and a touchdown. Jordan Addison with 6 receptions, 69 yards, nice, and a touchdown. TJ Hawkinson with 5 receptions, 68 yards. We have Aaron Jones with 4 receptions for 30 yards. Cam Akers with 2 receptions for 15 yards and a touchdown. CJ Ham had 2 receptions for 15 yards. And Johnny Munt had 1 reception for 7 yards. Then we come to the final game until tonight's game. But if you see this on Tuesday, then it would be yesterday's game. We have the Commanders and the Falcons, with the Commanders win it 30-24 in overtime on Sunday Night Football. We have Michael Penix Jr. with 19 carries, 19 completions out of 35 attempts, 223 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Bijan Robinson had 17 carries, 90 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Tyler Algier had 3 carries, 19 yards. Ray McLeod had 1 carry for 14 yards. And Michael Penix had 2 carries for 3 yards. Drake London had 7 receptions, 106 yards. Kyle Pitts had 4 receptions, 44 yards, and a touchdown. Darnell Mooney had 2 receptions for 37 yards. Ray McLeod had 1 reception for 13 yards. KhaDarel Hodge had 1 reception for 9 yards. Bijan Robinson had 3 receptions for 8 yards. And Charlie Warner had 1 reception for 6 yards. For the Commanders side of things, we had Jaden Daniels complete 24 passes out of 36 attempts, 227 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 8 interception. Jaden Daniels also had 16 carries for 127 yards. Brian Robinson had 13 carries for 60 yards. We had Chris Rodriguez with 5 carries, 16 yards, and a touchdown. Omalide Zacchaeus with 1 carry for 8 yards. And Jeremy McNichols with 1 carry for 5 yards. Omalide Zacchaeus had 8 receptions, 85 yards, and a touchdown. Zach Ertz had 6 receptions, 72 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Jamison Crowder had 3 receptions for 25 yards. John Bates had 1 reception for 14 yards. We had Chris Rodriguez with 1 reception for 12 yards. We had Brian Robinson with 2 receptions for 9 yards. Jeremy McNichols with 2 receptions for 5 yards. And Scary Terry with 1 reception for 5 yards. Last but not least, we had the Lions and the 49ers, and the Lions won it 40-34. We had Jared Goff complete 26 passes out of 34 attempts, 303 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Jahmyr Gibbs had 18 carries, 117 yards, and a touchdown. Excuse me. We had Craig Reynolds with 7 carries for 31 yards. Jamar Jefferson with 3 carries for 9 yards. We had Jameson Williams with 2 carries for -2 yards and a touchdown. And Jared Goff with 3 carries for -3 yards. Jameson Williams had 5 receptions, 77 yards, and a touchdown. Sam Laporta had 6 receptions for 64 yards and a touchdown. Amon-Ra St. Brown had 8 receptions for 60 yards and a touchdown. Jahmyr Gibbs had 4 receptions for 46 yards. Craig Reynolds had 2 receptions for I don't know why I just almost said 13, for 35 yards. And Allen Robinson had 1 reception for 21 yards. For the 49ers, we have Brock Purdy complete 27 passes out of 35 attempts, 337 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. We had Joshua Dobbs, glad to see that name pop up again, with 3 completions out of 4 attempts for 35 yards, and Ricky Pearsall attempted the pass. Isaac Guerendo had 9 carries for 34 yards. Deebo Samuel had 3 carries for 16 yards. Brock Purdy had 3 carries, 12 yards, and a touchdown. Joshua Dobbs had 1 carry for 7 yards and a touchdown. and Ricky Pearsall had 2 carries for 6 yards. He also had 8 receptions, 141 yards, and a touchdown. George Kittle had 8 receptions for 112 yards. Jauan Jennings had 7 receptions for 67 yards. Isaac Guerendo had 4 receptions for 65 yards. We had Chris Conley with 1 reception for 13 yards. Kyle Juszczyk with 1 reception, 9 yards, and a touchdown. And Deebo Samuel Sr. with 1 reception, 5 yards, and a touchdown. We only have 1 more week of the regular season, and then it's off to the playoffs. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like, subscribe, comment, do really whatever you want to do. And yes, I shaved for this last bit. I just hope you guys enjoyed it. And I'll see you all in the next one. See you around.